you. Thanks, Jess. And I just want to thank Dr. Ricky Fortune, who just slipped in, because she's the one who oversaw this research for me, so if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So thanks, Ricky. All right, so lessons learned from lifelong social activists defining and overcoming barriers to activism. That's what we're talking about today. This is actually the last quote that I looked at when I was putting together my slides, and I thought it just so perfectly captured activism and the subject for today. Find the humanity that will be inclusive rather than divisive. It's a constant challenge. I call it not only a challenge, but an opportunity. It's from Reverend Bradley. You'll meet more of him later. Okay, so this is from a study that I conducted through the school. I got IRB approval in September of 2013. It's a phenomenological qualitative study, which means that I was really looking at what is social activism to these older social activists and how does it impact them. For specifically what I'm talking about today, the two research questions that were addressed was what barriers have lifelong social activists faced while engaging in advocacy work, and what strategies have lifelong social activists used to overcome barriers related to social activism. So we'll go into both of those areas. I did one focus group and then 8 individual interviews. So there was an inclusion criteria to be in the study. I asked that all participants were born in the government-issued or GI generation or the silent generation. So they basically, which is kind of funny because it's the silent generation and they're activists. So they had to be born in 1945 or before. They had to have at least 3 decades of social activism and the cognitive ability to participate in a focus group or individual interview. I really determined the cognitive ability by having a discussion with them. Like whenever they signed up for this study, I just talked to them and saw if they were able to answer questions, and everyone was fine. So this was a convenient sample. I knew of an organization that engaged in social activism and also had a lot of older people. So at a regularly scheduled meeting, I announced the study. From that announcement, I had 9 people sign up to do the focus group. And then from the announcement and the focus group, I had 8 more people that were brought in as individual interviews. So there were 17 total participants. 10 were female, 7 were male. The age ranged from 68 to 93, with the mean age of 84. So they were older, quite a bit older. The length of time of participating in social activism ranged from 40 to 75 years, with the mean of 57 years. 16 of the participants identified as Caucasian and 1 identified as African American. At the time of the research, all but 1 lived in New York State and 1 lived in Rhode Island. So I added levels of education here. So you can see this is how many participants, the numbers here, and then this is their level of education. So 1 participant had a high school diploma, 2 had trade school training, 1 had some college, 3 had a bachelor's degree, 8 had a master's degree, and 2 had a doctorate degree. So one of the reasons I added it is because there's 10 females in the sample. So they were getting their degrees starting in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, when there really was a ceiling that it was very difficult to break through. And so the three lower educations are all women, but then that puts 7 in the higher education. So some of them did get a little later, like in the 60s, but some of them were getting it in the 40s and 50s. The other reason I added it goes back to what Jenny was saying, is that other studies have shown a correlation between activism and education. And the reason they think there's the correlation is because they have money. A lot of times they have more money that allows them to be able to, but they also have the resources. They understand the problems better, and they have the resources to be able to fight the problems. Okay, so my analysis plan, I used Atlas TI to organize and code the data. I used an inductive approach, which is what you typically use with qualitative research. So the code list was made from their statements, and I combined codes to make more complex codes, which then turned into themes. I used triangulation by doing a focus group and individual interviews. I also had data from the participants. It was interesting because they would show me newspaper articles, they would email me things, so I had a lot of data from different sources. I did member checks, which means after I analyzed the data and I came up with the themes, I sent it to several of the activists and asked if it was accurate. I put peer review, although it's not really peer because there were 2 faculty members who really helped me, so we're not peers, but it was the best way to word it. And this really helps with the credibility and the dependability of the study. Okay, so thinking about doing research with older adults, what do you think are some challenges with interviewing older adults? Memory problem, and I did have that. I had a couple where they didn't have a cognitive problem, but they'd say, oh, what do you call that? And they would describe it, and they couldn't remember exactly what it was. Hearing. And I did have several that were very hard of hearing, where I actually had to get up right next to them and yell the question. And then also visual problems. So what are the benefits to the participant? If you're the older adult and you're in the study, how do you think that might benefit them? Exactly. That's the biggest one. I can tell. I'm still in contact with most of the people in the study, and some of them are writing books. Just because of after talking to me and like telling their story, it really it made them feel important and that they really need to get their story out. And they still will give me things like, oh, I forgot to give you this. And it's been 2 years since I interviewed them. So, yeah, that's a huge part of it. So, yes, great answer. Okay, here's another important question. Why is this important for social workers? And I put the answer up there. It's important because of the social work value of social justice. As social workers, we are called to pursue social change, particularly with and on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed individuals. And here it says our efforts should be primarily focused on issues of poverty, unemployment, discrimination, and other forms of social injustice. So as social workers, this is one of our 6 core values. That's why this study is important for us. Okay, so major themes. When we're talking about the barriers to social activism, there were 2 major themes: personal obstacles and external obstacles. And when we're talking about overcoming barriers, there were 2 major themes: individual strengths and relational factors. Now this is on your handout. And I did this to help you kind of organize where we're at, because it can get a little confusing. So the question is the barriers. We're starting with the barriers. They're going to identify some barriers. From the barriers, we have the 2 themes: personal obstacles and external obstacles. And then from the themes, we had categories. So there's different categories within each theme. And to make it even more complicated, some of the categories have subcategories. But don't worry about that too much. But I thought if you had a handout that it might help you actually be able to see where we're at within the conversation. Okay, so we're going to start with barriers to social activism, personal obstacles. The statement was coded as a personal obstacle when the barrier was internal or it was something the activists could control. That's what really identified it as a personal obstacle. Most participants, 82%, described personal obstacles that impacted their activism efforts. There were a couple of less endorsed obstacles that didn't make it into the categories, but I thought they were worth mentioning. One was financial, so some of them weren't able to do everything they wanted to do because of financial limitations, and then the inability to pursue desired causes. So they would say, when I was younger, I put feed children in Africa. They'd say, I really wanted to go to Africa and feed the children, but I couldn't. Things like that. But they weren't enough to actually add into the categories. So the 2 categories of personal obstacles were fear and lack of exposure. Fear was described in 2 distinct ways. It was described as a response to threats, and we're going to discuss more about threats in a couple of slides, and as fear of rejection. They were afraid that their friends, family, coworkers would not accept them or would reject them for their activism. And now you're getting ready to meet the activists. Out of the 17, you'll get to meet 15 of them today. Dr. Lane. Dr. Lane was 74 years old when I interviewed him, and he had 57 years of activism. He became interested in activism when he saw Martin Luther King Jr. speak at his school when he was in college. He started, obviously, with the civil rights movement and actually worked in Tennessee and Mississippi doing voter registration work. You're going to hear me say this multiple times today because these are lifelong social activists. So he didn't stay in the civil rights movement. He also worked for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, anti-poverty initiatives, peace activism, and I'm sure I'm leaving out some. Pretty much any cause that comes along, they're in it. So, but he started with civil rights. So he's explaining a threat. He had gone to an event with a mixed group of people in the South. So there were white people and black people who went together somewhere, and this is what happened. It was the middle of the night. I got some phone calls from my phone in the apartment, probably about 2 o'clock in the morning, and whoever it was wouldn't say anything. He would breathe very heavily. I sensed it was a man. This happened about 4 times within about 10 minutes or so. I got scared, so I called my campus pastor friend, and I told him what happened. He said, "Dr. Lane, get the hell out of there. It's the Klan." He said, "If you don't move, they're going to mob you." He actually used the word scared. A lot of them didn't. This is Catherine. Catherine was in the focus group. She was 88 years old at the time of the group and had 50 years of activism. Now, she actually, and a few of them had this, she actually focused heavily on women's rights, and she actually co-founded a state-level crisis rate organization in the mid-1980s. She also did some environmental justice, anti-poverty initiatives. I know she did some voting registration as well, but really focused on the women's rights. And she's describing the working situation they had when they first started the Crisis Rape Center. We worked in the church basement downstairs, had an office. And one of the things, we hated to leave at night alone. I came down here many times because I was treasurer and did the finances and then have to leave alone because a woman, several people, had actually been dragged out of the parking lot out here, and one of them was raped. So she's discussing what they would do. She'd come and walk people out to try to keep safety. Now, the important thing to remember about this type of fear, the response fear, what I found really interesting is very few of them said the word fear or scared. The other thing is they could have quit at any moment, and you'll hear some more threats that were made against them and really the severity of some of them. Not only did they not quit, it really seemed to reinforce the cause. So anytime they were in danger, they dug their heels in and said, boy, this is exactly what I should be doing. Okay, so the next subcategory of fear is the fear of rejection. This was really interesting. I actually didn't expect this before I did the research. They were afraid of the rejection from their family, their peers, their colleagues, and it was this, what they really described was this internal identity struggle that they really wanted to be liked and they wanted to be accepted, and they were afraid that if they were really out there with their activism, that people wouldn't accept them. Now, what was interesting was the process of change. So as they started to really internalize the activist identity, I am an activist, that's who I am as a person, then they externalized the disapproval of others. So then it became very much like, oh, well, I don't know what their problem is, they're wrong. Obviously, I'm right and they're wrong. But it did, this period of time that they had an emotional impact on them. A lot of them talked about feeling guilty when they didn't stand up for what they considered to be right. So that was really interesting. We're going to meet Vincent. Vincent was in the focus group. He was 84 years old at the time of the group and had 50 years of activism. Vincent grew up in the South and remembers at the age of 5 seeing a picture of an Indian being scalped on his oatmeal box. And he said he could remember just the rage inside of him at seeing that picture, but he really didn't act on his activism or become an activist until he was really influenced by other people in his 30s. And once he became involved, he started with the civil rights movement, but what he did was huge. He co-founded an inner-city organization that helps people still to this day. It was over 40 years ago. It's still running today. It's pretty big. It helps people with food, helps people with housing, helps people with clothing, helps them with all sorts of support. So he was the co-founder of this. He's not involved with that, like on running it, but he still does anti-poverty initiatives and other types of activism. So he's discussing when he first was entering the activism world. Just about every Sunday, there was a very subtle but strong racial anti-black remark made, and in very subtle ways, like, well, some of my best friends are black. Well, what's the rest of the story, you know? And I would go home from church, inside just seething, just about every Sunday saying, I didn't have guts enough to stand up to my contemporaries and say you're full of it. And that's bothered me a lot over the years. Fran was our baby. She was the youngest participant. She was in the focus group. She was 68 years old at the time of the focus group and had 50 years of activism. She got involved with activism as a college student, and her first act of activism was to protest the Vietnam War. She has done multiple social justice causes since then. She works extensively on women's rights, anti-poverty initiatives. She still does peace movements. Like many of the others, if there's a cause, she's in it. And is still very, very strong. And she's describing when she first started, like when she was in college and was first starting to become an activist. We would go to the Saint College bar drinking beer back when the age was 18, and when anyone would make a racial joke or something like that among, we were all friends. My boyfriend stood up, and even though it would be a good friend, I would be socially conscious, let's just laugh and not say anything. Okay, so the second category of personal obstacles was lack of exposure. All right, so they explained this in a couple of different ways. There was lack of exposure because of geographic segregation. And if you remember when a lot of them started doing the activism, people may not have had a car. Or if they lived in a family, the family had one car and they had to share it. There wasn't as much public transportation, so geographic segregation was an issue. But then they also talked about the lack of exposure to the community. So if they had someone white who wanted to work on civil rights, they had a lack of access into the black community. And then there was also a lack of access to the actual people once they got into the community. Callista did an individual interview. She was 89 years old at the time of the interview and had 74 years of activism. She was my only social worker. She started as a teenager, as you can tell, with her activism. And she was interesting because she didn't start with the civil rights movement because it didn't exist. She started with integrating different communities of ethnicities, Irish and the Italians, the Hispanics. So she started before the civil rights movement. And she worked her whole life on any cause, just like most of the other ones. The civil rights movement, anti-poverty work, women's rights, almost anything you can think of she did. You would think she probably would have been one of the easier interviews. She was actually one of the hardest interviews because I was looking very forward to interviewing her as a social worker, so I didn't get as much out of her as I did other participants. But she's describing when she first started as a teenager. There were cultural barriers mostly. In a big city where the neighborhoods are, that's the Italian neighborhood and that's the Hispanic neighborhood, and you have clusters of people all over. And then they would move to the suburbs in groups. So really that geographic separation. And then they moved and stayed kind of segregated. Nell was in the focus group. She's 92 years old at the time of the group. She had 70 years of activism. Nell's a Spitfire. She is still a Spitfire at 94 years old. She became involved in activism as a young adult. She received a bachelor's degree in nursing and joined the Army and went off and worked with the Red Cross during World War II. When she came back, she grew up in New York City. She came back, she went to work with a doctor and went into the segregated South to do work. So she did civil rights, women's rights, anti-poverty initiatives, multiple other causes. To this day, in the assisted living facility she lives in, she changes policies within there all the time. So she's talking about being in the South. I had an opportunity to go to Tennessee as an exchange nurse to work out really in the boonies. And that was really an eye-opener because segregation was still going on. Okay. So there was lack of access to specific populations for multiple reasons. As you can see, race, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, age, ability. We still have these barriers in place, so you can imagine how they were 50, 60 years ago. And it was really rooted in the impact of the historical oppression. So I use the example, if you were white, you wanted to work on the civil rights movement, gaining access to the black community, they were not going to really necessarily trust you. You really had to earn their trust. But it was the same thing with people who were wanting to work on disability issues, because they were, even at this time, they were still hospitalized and treated like really subhuman. People with mental health issues were chained, different things. And then you had religious beliefs, the way people who thought differently and how they were treated. Sexual orientation, I mean, look at where we're at today. Can you imagine where we were then? So it's very difficult to gain access if you were not part of the member group into a population. Reverend Bradley, he had the opening quote that I talked about. He was really, out of all of them, a revolutionary. At the time of the interview, he was 91 years old and had 71 years of activism. So Reverend Bradley became interested in activism in the early 1940s when he was at Yale Divinity School. And he started working on integration in the 1940s and 50s. And he really started with what he had access to, which was the church. So he started integrating churches in his community 1940s, 1950s. He was fascinating. You'll hear more about him later. And he worked on multiple issues: anti-poverty initiatives, civil rights, LGBTQ rights, religious rights for all people, not just for what he believed, but for all people, women's rights, many other causes. He had one of the first open and affirming churches in the country. And an open and affirming church is a church that not only welcomes people from the LGBTQ community, but they are in positions of power within the church. He did that in the 1960s, if you can believe it. I couldn't believe it. Okay, so this is what he has to say. So the 34 years I served as pastor at that church, those 34 years were a tremendous, just a constant challenge of opening these doors. And not just opening them, but using them and creating relationships and dealing with particular issues. In terms of both historic barriers between the North and the South in our country, then also the barriers of race, the barriers of faith groups, which initially were barriers rather than cooperation, and the barriers of sexual relationships. Ava. Ava was in the focus group. She was 92 years old and had 52 years of activism at the time. I really wanted to include Ava because she's such a good example of a support person. So not everyone's a leader in the social activism movement, and Ava readily said, I am not a leader. And she's never led anything, but she supported the leaders, and she supported them in multiple ways. So if they were going to do a march, she would go get the permits. If they were going to do flyers, she'd make the flyers and distribute the flyers. She made food for people, and she still does that. So she worked hand in hand with a community organizer. And she started in the civil rights movement, but also supported women's rights, peace movements, anti-poverty initiatives, LGBTQ initiatives, and has always stayed a support person. So she's talking about lack of access, and she's really talking about that personal connection. So I think he's the community organizer she worked with. I think he may have asked the question, who do we know as black people? And nobody knew any black people very personally. Okay, so now we're on to external obstacles, which was the second theme under barriers to social activism. So the statement was classified as an external obstacle if the event or the barrier was out of the activist control, and the other thing was that the intent was to stop social change. So it's outside their control, and the intent is to stop social change. Most participants, 74%, discussed external obstacles that impacted their activism efforts. So the external obstacles, the categories, were threats, resistance from peers, family, coworkers, friends, resistance from the public, and resistance from organizations. We're going to start with threats. So the participants experienced threats in multiple ways. They had verbal threats. They were spit on as well. They had physical threats, and then they were actually physically attacked. And then some of them talked about death, obviously not to themselves, but to other activists. Pamela. Pamela was in the focus group. She was 86 years old at the time of the group and had 68 years of activism. She was really motivated to become an activist by a speaker. She saw a speaker and wanted to immediately become involved. So she actually started working for a civil rights organization at the age of 18. She has been involved in multiple social justice issues, just like many of the other ones, including women's rights, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, anti-poverty initiatives, and many more. She actually still does do voting registration in neighborhoods where a lot of people won't go. Like at night, she just goes right in and talks with people and eats with them, and she's great. So she's talking about her first assignment with this group that she was working with. One of the first assignments I had was helping to desegregate a roller skating rink. There were 3 of us, a male nurse, there was me, and there was a black gentleman. He was probably 6 feet tall and was not welcome in the roller skating rink. So the 3 of us would go down. We would put the black gentleman in the middle of us, and we would skate. They would trip us. Sarah and James were actually a married couple who were in the focus group. Sarah was 74 years old, had 55 years of activism, and James was 84 years old and had 40 years of activism at the time of the group. So they had a lot of separate activism things they did before they were married. But then activism actually brought them together, and that's how they got together and got married. And they have extensively, since they've been married for over 30 years, they do international activism, and they go into Latin America, especially into places where there's civil war, and they help the people there. So they've actually built schools, they work with the women, and they go every year, and they still go every year. But they also do peace movements. They do religious freedom for all, fight for that, and anti-poverty initiatives in their spare time when they're home. So this is what happened when they were in Nicaragua, one of the years they were there. We were shot at and held hostage for about an hour during an attack by former Contra soldiers in uniform and with arms on a road in northern Nicaragua. We saw a man shot during that incident. He was in another vehicle on the road next to us. My oldest son was with us at the time, and he was visiting us between college semesters. It was he who held my head down when we hit the dirt. She actually emailed this story to me. It's about 2 pages. They don't know if the man died. They drove up to try to see. They weren't sure if he died. And she talked about having compassion for the soldier who personally frisked her and had a gun on her. She asked him if he would not take her eyeglasses, and he didn't take her glasses. And she said he was really young, and she had a lot of compassion for him, even though he was holding her hostage, which I thought was really interesting. And then Dr. Lane, who we've already met, who was down in the South. This is a gentleman that he worked with. This is another activist that he worked with, and he'd actually just stayed at this man's house about 2 months prior to this. 2 busloads of Klansmen in the middle of the night had burned down his house and property. He had escaped. I'm sorry. He had gotten his family out next door over to the store, his wife and children out the back, and he grabbed a shotgun and tried to fire back. They were shooting in his house while they firebombed, but by the time he got out the door, his lungs were so filled with fumes that he collapsed and was brought to the emergency room and died within a few hours. So this was a black activist he worked with in the South. It took them 30 years to convict the white men, the Klansmen who killed him. Resistance. This is the next group of external obstacles, the next categories. So the participants experienced resistance in multiple ways. There was relational resistance, which was basically people they knew, public resistance, people they didn't know, and then organizational resistance. So the relational resistance, this could be a lack of support. So this might be, you're an activist, I'm not, I don't want to hear about it, don't talk to me about it, you do your thing, I'll do my thing. Lack of support. Then there was blatant disapproval, where their loved ones would actually try to humiliate them. They would question their motives, sometimes do things to interfere with the activism. And then there was unintentional ignorance. And this one really surprised me. I didn't expect this one. But this was with other activists that they worked with. And so it would seem they have the same goals, the same vision, and they're working toward the same thing. But the people they're working with are going about it a completely different way that they are, and they saw that as harmful. Like whatever they were doing, they kind of saw it as the wrong way. Daniel. I did an individual interview with Daniel. He was 88 years old at the time of the interview and had 50 years of activism. He began his activism in the 30s when he took an international job to help the indigenous people in Bolivia. He was helping them secure their own food and be able to make their own money. And after he worked in Bolivia, he actually went to other countries in Europe to where their towns had been destroyed in World War II, helped them rebuild their towns, helped them secure water. So he did a lot of international social work, activism. But he also did a lot of activism when he was in the United States, too. He extensively worked with kids, like foster kids, runaway kids, did a lot with them. He participated in voter registration, and I think he also did some like anti-poverty type initiatives. This is, I think, Darren, you were saying, they would sometimes forget all the stuff they did, and then sometimes then they'd be like, oh, I did this too, and throw something in. So he's talking about unintentional ignorance with the people he worked with in Bolivia. You had to accept some limitations of co-workers who had not quite got it. Some of the missionaries were they were fine people, but they hadn't been exposed to a little bit of, education. Some guy feels called, which is valid, but then he raises money, has a plan, goes to Bolivia and starts preaching. But they also realized after a while there was more to trying to save people and that you had to start dealing with their living needs. This is James. Remember, he's married to Sarah. We just heard about him being held hostage. He's discussing a coworker of his when he gave him a flyer to come to a speech about Nicaragua. He handed him the flyer. He took it and crumpled it and threw it in the wastebasket. So there is all kinds of ways of showing your disagreement with people who are trying to make progress. And then Fran, remember Fran's our baby. She is also discussing co-workers. I stood in front of that peace pole at the United Methodist Church every Tuesday. I'd leave work, and believe me, my friends at work were not supportive of my opinion. She was protesting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Public resistance. Okay, so public resistance was very similar to the relational resistance, only they didn't know the person who was doing it. There was also multiple methods of the resistance, so I put discussions, but it really wasn't discussions. They would be yelling at them, different things. And sometimes they would write letters, and they would circulate petitions. They would threaten them. These are the ways they tried to stop. And they also would create a false dichotomy. Okay, Reverend Jones. Reverend Jones is an incredible leader. You're going to hear some more about him. He was 76 years old when I did an individual interview with him and had 60 years of activism. Reverend Jones grew up in the Appalachian Mountains in a very, very poor area. He also had a brother who was disabled. So he was kind of a right fighter, like right out the gate. He began his social justice activities as a teenager, similar to Callista, the social worker. He worked extensively for civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, disability rights, environmental rights, anti-poverty initiatives, several others. He's done a lot of things. You're going to hear a lot from him. So he's discussing moving up actually to a town in New York, unfortunately, and he had just done a lot of civil rights movement, and then he moves up here, and this is what happens. I discovered that the restaurants, cafes in the town are not serving black people. Excuse my language, but hell, that's just what I came out of. Members of the little community, members of my church, the then mayor, even the director of the local museum, etc., they kind of tell me, to quiet it. His protest. Mauve. Mauve's awesome. You will love Mauve. She was 73 years old when I did my individual interview with her. She had 57 years of activism. Mauve, like a couple of the others, began her activism as a teenager. She lived in a poor rural community, so she started fighting for food security within her community and trying to get food to people. That was how she started. Huge feminist. They were all feminists, including the men, but she may have been the biggest one. She continued to be she was a community organizer as a young adult. She fought for civil rights, anti-poverty initiatives, children's rights, women's rights, peace movements, environmental justice, and like many of the others, anything else that came along. She's a dog in the fight. So she's going to discuss the false dichotomy. I was going to give you examples, but I forgot when I pulled the slide up. But I'll let her tell you what it is. So people try to put people in boxes. If you're for peace, you're against our soldiers. If you're for peace, you don't care about security. I care very much for those soldiers. Every once in a while, we will have a peace vigil. Someone will come up and say, "How dare you do this? I have a son fighting." And all I can say is, I hope your child will return safe and sound, and that must be sincere. Other ways they created the false dichotomy is, if you were a white person, you were fighting for civil rights, well, you just don't like white people. If you're fighting for environmental justice, you're not for jobs. If you're against fracking, you're not for jobs. Those are other ways they created the false dichotomy. Organizational resistance. This was in the form of policies. Some were formal, some were informal, by organizations and businesses, but it also included state tactics by police officers. So several of them demonstrated and went on marches, and they talked about them putting up barriers, like they had a permit to march a route, and they put barriers up, and several of them were tear gassed, which they were pretty proud of. And other ways the police would try to deter them. And again, it was intended to prevent social change. Okay, so this, I know they're all my favorite, but Marissa, she's I almost cried during her interview, and I don't cry, so it was very touching. Marissa was 93 years old. I did an individual interview with her. She had 75 years of activism. She has been a leader in multiple social justice movements. She was the first female president of the NAACP in her community. She led multiple marches and demonstrations for civil rights, women's rights, educational rights, worker rights. She lived in the community that she organized until the age of 95. She just had to move out of her community. So she's discussing, so she was chosen to be the chairman of a committee to decide if the town that she organizes would build a community college. And she was chosen as the chairman. Well, anyway, I agreed. I was the chairman. There were 49 people on that committee. Well, anyway, we find out they had decided they didn't want the college. I went to the politician that appointed me. I said, "Do you want this college?" And he said no. Dr. Lane again, we're familiar with him by now. He's talking about an informal policy at the church that he was working at in Mississippi. I think it was in Mississippi. And I sat in as my first time duty, and lo and behold, an ad hoc committee had been appointed and was making a record as to what to do in the congregation if any black people showed up at the door. The background of this was, I didn't know this until later, was that a number of young, mostly young people, were attesting how segregated the churches were and what they would do if black people came to a white church. This was 63, the fall of 63. And the recommendation of this committee was that the usher should not turn them away at the door, but rather bring them into the church and seat them in the front pews with the hope that they would become so embarrassed that they would never come back. And that was their recommendation. Okay, so it's the barriers. Any quick questions over the barriers? Okay, now we're going to move on. Now for the good news. We're moving on to overcoming the barriers. So this chart, sorry, I had some problems making it this morning, is on the back of your worksheet. So the question was, what are the strategies that the activists use to overcome barriers? And there were two main themes that came out of it, which were individual strengths and relational factors, and then each of those had several categories. And we're going to start with individual strengths. So the statement was classified an individual strength if the way through the barrier came from within the activist, if it was internal. So most of the participants, 76%, discussed using personal strengths for overcoming barriers. They would tell stories. That was a big way in how they got across how they overcame the barriers. Like when I would ask them, they would just start telling me a story. So that's how I got a lot of the information. There were three distinct strengths: persistence, courage, and communication skills. So we're going to start with persistence. Participants described persistence as not giving up. It was an internal drive. That was really how it was within them to not give up. They also really pointed out that if you're going to be an activist, you are not going to be liked by everybody. You need to get used to not being popular, and you have to reconcile that. And another interesting thing they pointed out that I liked was that a lack of success did not equal failure. So if their goal was to, let's say, integrate something, they were looking to integrate a community or integrate something, if it wasn't completely integrated, but people were starting to think differently, that was a success. And they're going to talk a little bit more about that. Pamela, remember Pamela, our skating friend, who was trying to integrate the skating rink. So this is how she did it. We kept going a number of times, the three of us. Then we got some other members to come, and finally the roller skating rink gave up and they were accepted. So she used persistence to overcome physical attacks and threats. Marissa, remember Marissa, and they just tried, that politician just told her no, that he did not want that community college to be built. So Marissa says, this is her reply, "Then I said to myself, hell, you are not going to get away with that." He didn't know who he was dealing with. I knew all the people on that committee. So the community college was founded in 1967 and has awarded degrees to over 17,000 students. Marissa's parents, I have to tell you this for her. Her parents were born in West Virginia. She was my one African-American participant in the 1800s. Her parents were born. They did not have a formal education, so education was very important to her. And hell, they did not know who they were messing with. So this is Ma really just articulating persistence. By continuing, by not giving up, and by articulating. You know, life is not a popularity contest, and if you're looking to make yourself popular and liked on all fronts, you're probably not going to be an activist. I think our job as activists are to make cracks in the system. And then I always say you crawl into the cracks. And if there are cracks in the foundation, what happens? Courage was the second individual strength they identified. And courage was always described as an action. And they used courage when faced with multiple barriers, including the threats, relational resistance, and public and organizational resistance. So this is Reverend Jones, again, that went to that town. Remember the town, and they told him not to complain. So this is him discussing when he was a teenager in 1954. So he was chosen to speak to the President of the United States about integrating the schools. So the organization arranged for an appointment for us to go and meet with President Eisenhower at the White House. We were only like 8 of us in a little circle, semicircle. Now he said this so nonchalantly, I really didn't get it. So I asked, with the President? And he says, yeah, with the President. We were there saying we'd like the President to act in terms of sending the National Guard, you see, and we were there as young people. So he was advising the President of the United States as a teenager to send the National Guard to help to integrate the schools. So I thought that took some courage. Vincent. So Vincent was the one that he was discussing how he didn't have the courage to stand up to the people that he went to church with when they were talking about black people and making racist remarks. So this is how he overcame the fear of rejection. Or I should say this is when he overcame the fear. This is some of the things he would do. So he's talking about being at work. But he's also talking about being on vacation in Germany before that. So it's a little confusing, but you'll get it. Well, Hitler was elected to power in 1933, so he didn't waste any time. Step number 1 is put your dissidents in a concentration camp. That stuck in my mind more than anything else about that concentration camp over there. So we come back, we are sitting at the table there in the cafeteria, and hear these remarks about those Buddhists out there beating their drums. Nasty remarks. And my contribution, and this is one of my levels of activism, was to tell the story. Was to tell the story I just told you about, what Hitler did to the dissidents. I said, so those are dissidents out there. So step number 1 is put those dissidents down out there. Then we are right on track with Nazi Germany. And generally, I would get a very positive response to that, and they quit making their remarks. So communication skills is the last individual strength, and the participants used communication to understand other people's points of view. So the people that were on the other side of the issue, they really wanted to understand and know what they felt and what they were talking about. They used communication to build bridges between communities and to progress social change. This seemed to be the most important personal strength for successful social change. Okay, so here's Mob, really just talking about being able to communicate. You need to tolerate people who have different views than your own, to learn from them. What I always found interesting is how you can meet people who have rather horrific views, but that's not how they treat people. So I thought that was a really interesting quote. That she's talking about that once you really get to know the person, they're really not as bad as you kind of make them out to be. So using that communication to really, not necessarily to become their best friend, but to understand where they're coming from. Reverend Jones, this is one of my favorite quotes out of the whole study, and there will be an example of this later on. You've got to be able to speak power to power, but somehow be smart about that. You use things that are forceful that can change the dynamic of the equation. Make sure it's smart. Make sure also that it is reconciling, peaceful, that it's not to destroy, but ultimately build up. Don't let me forget to tell you the quote that is going to go right back to that. Daniel, remember Daniel working with the guys with the unintentional resistance in Bolivia? So this is how Daniel overcame relational resistance, the unintentional ignorance, and also a fear of rejection. I thought it worked for both. You just bring people together constantly in a setting of mutual discussion, not to satisfy everyone, but to help them understand maybe there's another way to look at this, or let's try this for a change. So I thought that was really important, that he's saying you just continually, if you have that unintentional resistance, you just keep meeting. And you're not meeting to placate them, you're meeting to really try to get them to come in, and then maybe you're the one who gives up. Like it's a give and a take to keep those relationships. We are on the last theme, overcoming barriers, and we're doing good on time. Relational factors. So a statement was categorized as a relational factor if the way to overcome the barrier was working with someone else or someone else was influencing that. All but one participant, 94%, discussed the importance of relationships and overcoming barriers to social activism. One of my participants in the focus group said very little. In fact, she really didn't talk about her activism. Other people talked about her activism, but she didn't talk about it, so she's the one who didn't comment on it. So really everyone in the study talked about relational factors. This was the most coded. One participant in the focus group actually predicted that this would be a theme. She said, no, this is going to be a theme, the relational factors. So when we're talking about relational factors, we're talking about leaders, allies, and exposure to diverse groups. We're going to start with leaders. So many of the activists were influenced by national or world-renowned leaders. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela actually died while he was doing data collection, so a lot of them talked about him. And they talked about others too. So the strong leaders they looked up to really provided hope for them, and they were also a model for them as to how to do things. And then, as you've learned, some of the participants were really kind of born leaders, and they started very young being a leader, but then a lot of the other ones who maybe weren't necessarily natural leaders, they became leaders. Dr. Lane. People that keep on keeping on despite all the obstacles that are making this seem as unrealistic as possible, model ways to bring about change. I thought that was just a really good way to put it, so I added that. Ava, remember Ava's our support person, and she's talking about the community organizer that she worked with and how he brought about change in their community. He brought together black kids from the community, and we opened up our fellowship hall for them to come in on Saturday nights to have dances. And the group was called The Goal. And then Judith is actually the one who didn't talk about it. She says, we don't allow dancing in here. Ava says, yeah, they may not have at one time, but after the community organizer came, the situation changed. It changed with him. Okay, so Marissa's talking about herself being a strong leader. And she's talking about when a coworker made a comment about the people in her group. Remember how she was the head of that committee and had 49 people on that committee? Well, the committee was made up of a lot of African Americans and Latina people, and a coworker made a really not smart remark to her, and this was her telling me about this and talking about her own leadership. He had no business saying that. He said it to the wrong person. Here's a little woman trying to lead these people, and you're going to ask if there's going to be stupid questions? They don't ask stupid questions. If they made a mistake, somebody else in the meeting would quickly correct them. Some of those engineers, some of those other professionals. So I knew how to lead. I knew how to stand on my feet. I like how she refers to herself as a little woman. She's so powerful. She says, I'm just a little woman. Allies. They talked about allies more than anything. This was the most coded out of all of the relational factors and all the other themes. Okay, so they said you need to form alliances with people outside of your member group. So if you want to do civil rights, if you're white, you need to form alliances with people who are black and brown. If you are straight and want to work with LGBT community, form alliances with people inside the LGBTQ community. This one actually surprised me. Form alliances with powerful, like-minded people. I did not expect that. So what they meant by that is they actually had a lot of people that were wealthy. They formed alliances with CEOs. Attorneys were big. A lot of them had alliances with attorneys because they helped them when they got arrested, or if people were threatening to fire them or something, they always had a team of attorneys. CEOs, attorneys, politicians. The politicians were key at really making policy changes. So that one was surprising to me, but they did. A lot of them formed alliances with powerful people. Form alliances with other activists. That's an important one. And then work with mentors. Marissa again. So she's talking about an alliance she formed with a white woman who was Jewish. And I'll read the quote and then I'll follow up with it. Another one of the women, she was Jewish, and look at me, what I am. We decided if we let them get away with not doing the portion of the contract, they'll take something else. So we said we're going to sue them. 2 women. We went to the woman lawyer who was the lawyer for the police department, and we asked her if she would take our case, just like that. So Marissa worked for the city, and they were trying to cut their benefits. So her and the Jewish woman sued the city, and they won. So, and they got workers' rights, they got benefits for everyone. This was in the 1960s. Reverend Jones, this is the power to the power. The power to the power statement, this is him putting it in action. And then the CEO, he was friends with the CEO of a major corporation. And then the CEO would always say to me, what would you like for me to do for you? I said, well, CEO, I'd like to see your major corporation divest its funds from South Africa. And then he laughed. That sounds so damn brazen, and so forth. But at the time, it wasn't brazen. It was sort of like he saw my spirit. I really would like for us to divest, you see, because that was the start of the divestiture of funds for South Africa. So he saw this friend about once a week. He said the same thing to him every single time. And about 6 months later, he heard on the radio that this major corporation had divested their funds from South Africa. He said he just couldn't believe it. And he called them up and he said, I just want to thank you for divesting your funds and have a good day. I hung up the phone. So it worked. Mauve, talking about allies. She gives really good overall statements to working with allies, or with all the themes. She gives really good statements. Always, always go with a group. Never as an individual. Activism is done with many other people. I found my independent voice and formed very, very strong relationships with women that I still have the bond with. So I added that because she's really showing the importance of working with other activists. But in working with those activists, it really helped her find her own voice. So it really strengthened her to be with the other activists. Okay, so Dr. Lane had actually a very famous mentor. His mentor was Jim Lawson. Does anyone know who Jim Lawson is? I thought Ricky might. Jim Lawson is a very famous activist, and he was at the ground level of the civil rights movement and was the one who told them to make it nonviolent. He's a professor. He orchestrated a lot of things, worked with King. So that was Dr. Lane's mentor, and he used him as a mentor working in the South, and he had called him up because he was going to go on this trip, one of his trips with a mixed group of people, wanted to know how to navigate that. So I got to know Jim, and when it came time for deciding how to travel to the conference in North Carolina, I called Jim and asked him advice on how to do that. He gave me very specific instructions as to places I would be safe and would be accommodated and where I would not. And when he says I, he really means we, because they went as a group, and he told stories of how they were refused service and everything, but he used his mentor to help him navigate the situation. Okay, the last relational factor is exposure. So they really stress to find strengths in communities or groups. Wherever you're working, you find their strengths and you use those strengths. You use their strengths, you use your strengths. Everyone's strengths being used. They said to create opportunities to integrate communities in multiple ways, not just racially, but also LGBTQ, ability, disability, just complete integration. And this was in the other group too, but form relationships with people outside of your membership group. So it's kind of beyond an alliance, it's form the relationship, become friends. This is Callista. Remember, Callista was one of the first people we heard from. She was the one, she's the social worker, and she's the one who worked with the groups of the Irish and the Italian and worked to integrate those communities. And this is how she did it. This was really overcoming those geographic barriers and the lack of access barriers. They couldn't be quite as narrow as they could at first, because at each step of integration, you brought in more people. The opportunities were there, and I just kind of moved in and through them. You didn't say anybody was right or anybody was wrong. It was just, what is each contribution? And that was a better way to go than to try to find the right way, which you could never get agreement on from a lot of diverse backgrounds. I thought that was very smart. So then I asked, how did you get other people to accept the other cultures? By involving them as you involved, whether it was an already existing group or whether it was just new people coming in, and that was a big part of it. So she would actually, I liked what she did, because she would take the focus off of their differences. She was kind of a little bit like Jane Addams, actually. She would have them come in and do like volunteer work, and they would make things for the poor kids and then go hand it out. And so she took the focus off that were different and then gave them tasks where they were always working together. So I thought that was really smart. So this is one way to integrate communities. This is what Mob did with a bunch of the women that she worked with who were also feminists. What we wanted to do is all these feminists wanted to live in the low-income community. First of all, we were low-income. We wanted to live there, organize, and try to make a contribution in our lives and the lives of our community. We were organizing our street around issues of housing. This was a period in which you felt the philosophy was community control, and so you wanted people to take control of their own communities. You wanted to make services available within this area. You wanted people to know each other, to help each other, to create community within community. And that's exactly what she did. Her and maybe 4 or 5 other women bought an old, dilapidated mansion right in the middle of a low-income opportunity. They were some of the only white people in that community, and they got to know their neighbors, and they would bring their neighbors, and they would go to city council meetings, and they would demand things, and she made it very clear that she was not there to help them, that she was there as a community member. She worked with them as a member. Reverend Bradley, this is the last quote. So this is a way to do it if you're not living in the community. This is a way to integrate the community if you don't want to go all out Jane Addams on them. So this is what Reverend Bradley did. We were smart enough to go into that part of the community without taking our own agendas. But what we did was go in to listen to people in the community to see what their agendas were. There were some black matriarchs, these wonderful black women who maybe have a family of 10 or a dozen kids. They were impoverished and they were having great difficulties. And so without even knowing how smart we were or what we were doing, we listened to them talk about what was going on in the neighborhoods, both with respect to landlords, with respect to schools, with respect to trash, with respect to housing, just so many things. And we got involved both intellectually and physically. We went almost every day. So him and a group of people would go in every day and talk to the people. And they did. There's a building named after him that was built for low-income people. I mean, he did really incredible things in his community. So I'm going to go back to what we started with our question. After hearing from the activists, what are some of the benefits of using older adults as research participants? They've already experienced this. So if you've been doing activism for 74 years, you've come across everything in that time. And so they're going to be able to really, it's going to be informative to us on how to really kind of overcome. I learned a lot from them and things that I want to incorporate.